topic. I expect us to talk all things end of life today, and you all will understand as we get to know Chris a little bit. Chris, for those that may not be familiar with us, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this interesting line of work.
Well, thank you, Steve, and good afternoon to everyone. Um, I had a rather curious track to ending up as a grief counselor. For most of my early career, I was in the business of film and television, and particularly international television, working for Discovery, the BBC, National Geographic, and so on. A rather alarming few years of ill health and heart surgery and all of that stuff led me to feel that maybe I needed to slow down and do something else. And I realized that I'd kept up with my psychology qualifications and continued to read the journals, all that stuff. And I enrolled in a postgraduate course in grief counseling, which is now my full-time job, and that was some 10 years or so ago. Now the reason why I thought grief counseling might be a useful area to proceed with is because, firstly, not everyone is doing it. Not a lot of people are doing it. Secondly, the people who are doing it and are doing a wonderful job are mostly female. There are not many male grief counselors around, and yet there are plenty of widowers who feel they can talk to a man better than a woman. And I suppose the third reason was to feel like I was actually making some progress in helping people out. And I'm often asked, isn't grief counseling a depressing area to be working in? To which the answer is no, it really isn't, because you can see material progress, you can see actual measurable progress over the weeks and months that you're helping someone navigate the trauma of acute grief. And I should perhaps mention that I also found myself working with a very broad definition of grief. It's not just a bereaved person whose partner or whoever has died. I'm actually working quite a lot with people who've suffered other kinds of loss. Ambiguous loss is what it's called, where it may be loss of a relationship, loss of financial status, loss of a job, relocation to an unfamiliar place, and so on. There's lots of reasons to be sad. And I find I can apply the brief work to those sorts of situations as well.
Man, well, this is great. And folks, how we came about today's discussion is sort of an interesting path. Um, when I first was introduced to Chris, we were on a panel together at a at the Sibley Senior Association, a hospital in the DC area, and we had not met each other. We both loved the message that each of us was sharing, and we got together and we connected. And Chris introduced himself as a certified grief counselor, and I had never heard that profession. So I was thinking, hey, Chris, why don't you come on? We'll talk about your profession. And this is a new resource that I wasn't aware of. Um, and so, Chris, you gave us a little bit of introduction to your profession, but approximately how many grief counselors are there? Do you know how many have gone through the certification process?
Oh my goodness. There are a number of different schools across the nation and indeed around the world who offer some version of
Okay,
certification. There are licenses as well that apply to social work categories and things like that. I really wouldn't know how to answer that, but
okay,
I would imagine, for example, here in the DC area, I would think the number is probably 50.
okay.
And if that's any kind of yardstick, that's kind of what we're dealing with.
Great, great. And then the now like another another profession that a lot of people aren't aware of is the end of life doulas. Um, and I'm dropping a link into chat there. Is that a profession that you complement, or do you find that some end of life doulas also have the certification as a certified grief counselor?
Yes, some do. I'm a big fan of end-of-life doulas. I know quite a lot of them actually around the world. One of my favorites is in Australia. But they do a really good job of preparing people for um, uh, end-of-life situations. So our tasks are complementary, I would say. They don't exclude each other and they don't compete with each other. They actually reinforce each other.
All right. Great. Okay. Questions are coming in, but I got a little story to tell folks on how we came about this topic today. Because when I met Chris, we scheduled an appointment. I had every intention of, learning about what a certified grief counselor is, but literally 2 days before we had our meeting, a longtime colleague and friend of mine shared that she and her husband who have both been diagnosed with dementia, were going to end their lives by going to a place called the Pegasus Institute in Switzerland. And Chris and I were chatting, and I was the first person that I shared this bit of news that I was still processing with. And he said, Steve, I did a documentary on that very center and an individual that made the decision to go to that center to end their life. And I was like, wow, could that be something that we talk about on this platform? And Chris agreed that it would be a great discussion topic. And so, Chris, uh, before I start reading the questions that are coming in, give us sort of the 50,000 foot view of this term medical aid in dying, and my friends who are going to go are who are planning on scheduling an appointment to go to this center in Switzerland. uh, give us a little overview of this topic, and then we can dive in deeper.
Certainly. Well, firstly, it's worth saying that medical aid in dying has a number of different terms, a number of different labels, which can cause some confusion. In some countries, it's called voluntary assisted dying. In others, it's called euthanasia. In others, it's called physician assisted dying. And in others, it's called medically assisted dying. Um, they all boil down to essentially the same thing, which is enabling a patient to bring about a more rapid end to their own lives by their own choice. Now, not surprisingly, perhaps, this is and has been for centuries, this is illegal. Suicide means self-homicide. And, number 5 on the list of thou shalt nots is thou shalt not kill. And so churches were frequently very adamant about the sin of suicide, and indeed still are. Um, but the point is that the compassion that societies have felt for ailing and aging members goes all the way back to the Egyptian times. There's evidence of a great deal of care and support being given to not only the person who's died, but also the families of the people who have died. And that goes all the way back to Egyptian times, where it's quite clear that some of those individuals were assisted, were as hastened, if you like, to meet their maker. Now, of course, more recently here in the US and UK and many other places, it's been a straightforward crime. not only to perform the act of self uh, euthanasia, but also to assist somebody to do that, because then you become an assistant to manslaughter. Um, that's changing, and it's changing quite rapidly. Um, uh, Everyone's probably aware of the clinics in Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands that offer this service, but it's growing around the world, mostly in terms of self-administered poisoning. There are a few places where the doctor can administer the lethal dose, but more often than not around the world, the patient has to be able to administer the dose themselves by pressing a button on a computer or opening a thumb wheel on a intravenous drip or whatever. And that agency, if you like, of being able to take your own life and commit that final act, if you like, has been a very firm rock in the procedures to date. The other one is the other two or three actually is that you usually need to be suffering from a terminal illness that has no more than 6 months to run before you die. Now, of course, that's a bit of an open question because, it isn't always possible to know how long it's going to run. And also it leaves out a whole bunch of areas of if you like, mental concern for those who simply have had enough and want to get off the bus. And I can talk a little bit about that later. But the third thing that is often difficult is that many of these places require residency. In other words, you have to be a resident of that country or that state in order to avail yourself of this service. And of course, that's not practical for a lot of people. But nevertheless, you hear of people who spend a lot of money to travel around the world to go to Switzerland, where you don't need to have a 6 month terminal illness diagnosis. You don't need to be a resident, and you don't need to be suffering from a physical only illness. You can also be suffering from a mental distress of some kind or other. So it's quite quite an onerous process to get through all that bureaucracy and numerous doctors' confirmations that you're being serious and that it's a worthwhile thing for you to be doing, and that it's understandable and gains the approval of the doctor in your home country, because the Swiss and in the Dutch and the Belgian, but especially the Swiss clinics that administer this service, they have to have supporting medical confirmation that this is an appropriate thing for this particular patient to be undergoing. So it's a long-winded bureaucratic process. So you can't just turn up and say, "I'd like to go, please." It takes at least 3 or 4 or 5 months just to get through that initial toing and froing. And I can tell you more about that when I tell the story of Laura from Australia. But it's a big subject, Steve.
Yeah, no, this is great. And I understand a little bit more about why my friend is going to Switzerland, planning to go to Switzerland, because dementia is a cognitive impairment that I guess in most states would prohibit them from the medical aid in dying
Yeah.
here in the US. Okay.
Yes, I mean it's been acknowledged in the Netherlands and Belgium that that's a reasonable qualification, but there are plenty of places where they don't say no. That's not, you can't put a time scale on it, and therefore it's not qualified.
Okay. Let me get to some of the questions that we have, and then I really do want to you to talk about this documentary that you created and tell us that story. But I like making sure, folks, the best part about these discussions is they're live and interactive. So if you have any questions, comments, throw them in there because that's what makes these conversations robust. Somebody says, is it possible for a surrogate to make the decision since the patient has dementia? Great question.
I don't know categorically what the answer is to that, but I would suspect that the answer would be no. Um, but it would be a qualified no, because if the patient has previously signed a living will or has entered into some sort of a contract that's been witnessed by a notary public or a lawyer or someone like that, then that might be a different matter. But I hunch that the simple answer to that question is no.
Yeah, yeah. Without documentation, I tend to agree, but I think that if somebody basically said that if I uh, lose my cognitive abilities, my desire is to um, go down this path at X said clinic or what have you.
Yeah,
Let's see. Someone says euthanasia is substantively different from aid in dying because the person does not self-administer the medication.
that's
Correct.
correct.
Okay, got it. Um, and Ken says, how often does a patient hoard sleeping pills or other potentially lethal medication and successfully commit suicide? Uh, Great question, Ken. And Chris, in your research, have you learned anything about that?
I don't know the answer to that question, actually. I mean, it's certainly true that people attempt suicide in many, many different ways, all of them rather obvious, from jumping off a rooftop to swimming out to sea and not coming back. But the question of how many sleeping pills do you need, or what substances can be lethal in what numbers, is not something I'm expert in. There would be, I'm sure, research websites that would give you that answer as to what's a lethal dose of, if you like, paracetamol. But I'm sure that such a website would also say don't try it because you run the risk of A, not succeeding, and B, ruining your liver. But I don't know. I think further research is needed in that regard.
Now, we're getting a lot of questions about why it's so difficult to pass some of these medical aid in dying laws in the US. And I think I saw that Maryland's last vote was 50-50, even though it was posed to pass in the next session. And I think one of the interesting stats when we talk about this is, and I just looked this up, this recent Gallup poll found that 71% of Americans believe doctors should legally be allowed to end a patient's life by a painless means if the patient makes that request. The majority, whenever this research is done, the majority of the public believes that this should be a program, yet it's very difficult to pass these state laws. Can you provide any insight on that?
Well, I hope so. Um, the the statistics are not unlike the statistics for abortion, in that many people believe that a woman should have the right of determination over her, reproductive health and biology. I would subscribe to that as well. And many people likewise would feel that, would feel that a person should have the right to determine when they end their life or not. The problem in both cases is that the nitty gritty detail is full of traps and debatable elements. I mean, for example, in the medically assisted dying community here in the United States, you'll often hear people talking about the slippery slope of, relatives being able to bump off Uncle Joe because they want access to his money. It's worth mentioning that there hasn't been anywhere in the world an example of that to date. And while in theory one can see how it might work, in practice it hasn't worked out that way. The other question is why has it been so difficult? I think it's become it comes back to a question of competence. Is a patient competent to make this decision legally, morally, ethically? And if so, how do you manage that so that they are treated appropriately? And if not, why not? And what do you do to prevent that behavior? Up until really very recently in my home country in the UK, it was actually, and in fact, I think it still is, a criminal act to help somebody end their own life, and because you end up being charged with murder, an associated murder. So, I mean, there are lots of carefully thought through proposals to try and get around these, but they take a lot of doing, and it's tough. I mean, I think the the population at large are often ahead of the legal system in these kinds of questions.
All right. I'm going to get through the rest of the questions, but my good friend Elva from Texas said that she just realized that you are the producer of the film Laura's Choice, which she has watched and thought was wonderful. It's an award-winning documentary. Let's take a quick break from the questions. And Chris, tell us a little bit about this documentary, the story, and some of the insights that you learned and can share with us about the journey of the person featured in the documentary.
Sure. No, sure. Happy to. The Laura's Choice story follows a very clear and not unusual path towards medically assisted dying. In that it's the accumulation of a number of distressing events in Laura's life that led her to finally make the decision to go down this final track. And the reason for that was, I mean, life is full of curveballs, and she and her granddaughter Sam. Sam is a very, very well-known and up-and-coming documentary filmmaker in her own right in Australia. She and Sam were going to go on a river tour, basically, that went from Amsterdam to Vienna. One of those dream tours that Laura had always wanted to do, and finally had the chance to do it. And because she's a filmmaker, Sam took a camera everywhere and filmed everything, expecting to do no more than assemble a rather cute family movie when she got back. But about halfway through the trip, Laura had a really bad fall and suffered concussion. And it kind of knocked the wind out of her sails a bit, such that she got worse and worse in terms of overall health, even on the duration of the cruise. And she developed pneumonia, which is, of course, very bad news for anyone, particularly a senior. At this time, Laura was 89. She went to hospital in Vienna, and they said, you've got to stay here for at least 4 weeks because you can't travel. And that was a really profoundly affecting circumstance for Laura, because she lived on her own. She was independent. She was a feisty old thing. She cherished her independence, didn't want to go into a home or anything like that. Um, Unfortunately, she lived on the exact opposite side of the continent from Sam and Kathy, her daughter. So they couldn't pop in every now and then to see how she was. And she went down and down and downhill more and more in feeling like she didn't have any point or purpose. And then something else happened that came in from outfield, which was that a chap called Dr. David Goodall, who was a world famous ecologist, had arrived at the age of 104 and didn't like it. And so he got in touch with the Swiss authorities, and nothing wrong with him apart from being 104. And he got in touch with the Swiss authorities, managed to get the permission to go there and be euthanized. And he did, and received a lot of publicity within Australia for doing this, because he was, to all intents and purposes, entirely rational and had all his marbles in a row, but just didn't want to stay around anymore. And that sowed the seed in Laura's mind to explore this further. And she did that privately at first. But when she started to get more and more into the subject area, because she was a bit of a whiz in terms of research, she found that this was a very appealing option for her. And she raised the question with her daughter and her granddaughter, who initially said, absolute rubbish, you can't possibly do something like that. We won't permit it. But she persisted, and she went on and on and on with the process of registering for the procedure, and on and on and on with trying to persuade her daughter and her granddaughter that this was an okay thing to be done. And anyway, it was her life, not theirs. Until in the end, the moment that really changed everything was when she got a letter from the Pegasus Clinic in Switzerland saying, you have an appointment on December the 19th to complete your medically assisted dying. And of course, up until that point in time, it had all been theoretical and somewhat abstract. But at that moment, and from that moment on, she had a date, and the date was December 19th. And it changed for Kathy and Sam the way they were approaching it, because they now realized that they were unlikely to be able to talk Laura out of it. And so they held parties, and they went through a kind of notional bucket list. They held a funeral for Laura with her there to hear what people had to say about her. And all in all, they tried to make the last few months of Laura's life as happy and pleasant as possible. And then they all got on a plane and landed in Basel, Switzerland, 12 hours later, or however long it takes, probably 20 hours later, where Laura went with Kathy and Sam. Laura went to the clinic, saw all around where it was all going to happen, who the people were, who the doctors were, and at every stage, because I should add that Kathy had approached me as a result of my previous work in the film and documentary world, if I would executive produce the project for her. And an executive producer is someone who keeps an eye on everything and makes sure everything stays on track, basically. And I had said, of course, because this was a rather interesting combination of my old life in television and my new life as a grief counselor. Anyway, here we are in Basel, Switzerland, with Laura going around the clinic, and at every point in time, because I saw all the rushes that were being filmed by Sam, who did a brilliant job, people were asking Laura, "It's not too late to back out. If you don't want to do this, you don't have to do it. If you're uneasy about it, we can put it off. If you're having second thoughts, that's not a problem. And Laura actually asked one of the doctors the day before she was due to have the procedure, what happens, because she was looking at the bed that she would be lying on, and discussing the procedure with the owner of the head of the unit called Rudy. And she said, Rudy, if I'm lying on this bed and I decide not to go through with it, what happens? And he said, that's perfectly fine. If you want to do that, you will, we'll get you up, give you a cup of tea, and make sure you're okay. So they were very keen to keep saying to her, is this what you want to do? And are you? And also they had to have the doctor's permission to say that she's competent. On the day, after a rather lavish breakfast, she went to the clinic with Sam and Kathy and had a intravenous drip put in her arm, leading to a bag of saline solution. And at the very last minute, the doctor said, are you absolutely sure you want to do this? And she said, yes. And he said, do you understand what happens if you push that little thumb wheel on the valve? And she said, yes. And he said, what will happen? And she said, I will die. And he said, that's right. He said, okay, well, anytime you want, you can push it. So she and Kathy and Laura and Sam talked a while, and they had some champagne, and they played one of their favorite bits of classical music. And at a certain point, 5, 10 minutes later, Laura said, I suppose we'd better go on with it. And she thumbed the wheel, and I would say between 15 and 30 seconds later, she lost consciousness, just went to sleep. And the doctor who was monitoring her heartbeat and her lungs, breathing and all that kind of stuff, about a minute or two later said, that's it, she's gone. And Kathy and Sam were, of course, in tears. But nevertheless, they both felt that they'd done the right thing by their mother and grandmother. And it was a very, very moving procedure to watch. And I think they felt in the end that they'd done the right thing, even given their initial doubts and queries about it. So that, in a
Wow.
nutshell, is
And
it.
folks, one of the main reasons I wanted Chris to sort of tell that story is even though I added the link to the film and the website the on the film, it's not the easiest film to watch now. Correct, Chris? It's in distribution and I believe in Australia, and it can be somewhat
Yes, I mean
difficult.
the simplest way of watching it, Steve, I think I gave you the link, is the Vimeo link, which is the sort of internal professional link, which needs a password. And I remember sending that to you, so you might be able to put that up. Um, I have to, for legal reasons, I have to say that it can't be distributed from that Vimeo recording because that would be breaking the law. But for personal consumption and reading, watching, then it's fine.
How about what would you say to if I add your email uh to the chat? Would it be inappropriate if I just added your email to the chat, and then if you wanted to share that with folks that emailed you, or would you prefer they email me directly?
It might be more efficient if they emailed you, because
Okay.
of course I'm
All right.
scooting around all over the place.
Yeah, and I don't want to get anybody in trouble, so I'm gonna I'll just put my email in there, and if you're interested, I'll send you the Vimeo link that Chris sent to me. I wouldn't want to put that up on a website or anything just in case it came
Thank you. I think that's right. The only
through.
other thing to mention is that the Vimeo link that Steve's going to make available to you all is the 1 hour cut down international version. And it's the one that I prefer much more than the others because the initial film was a 1.5 hour theatrical release. And when ABC Sydney transmitted it in Australia, all they did was cut it in two. So
Hmm.
you had part one and part two, which still amounted to nearly 2 hours, actually. So for a 1 hour watch, the Vimeo link's the best way to go.
Okay, great. And I think I think Nicole says that it might be available on Prime Video.
Oh,
But
really?
yeah, so
Could
we
be.
can look into that. But okay, I want to get back to the questions that seem to be coming in fast and furious. But before we
Sure.
do, um, your executive producer, you followed this. You were probably in the editing room hours on hours, trying to take this documentation and whittle it down into a story. What are some like emotional insights that you gain personally from that experience and Laura's choice? Any insights that you might share with us?
What an interesting question. I mean, I spent half my life in cutting rooms, editing rooms, initially on film and then on video. And it's a long process in which you become familiar with the subject, familiar with the material that the camera people have shot and the director has shot, familiar with the background of the story, and familiar with the characters. And that's what happened to me. I became familiar. I already knew Kathy and Sam. I didn't really know Laura, but over time, you get an impression of the individual and their character. And I already knew Kathy and Sam's character. So it definitely does begin to impact you, and you begin to wonder, what would I have done in that situation? What would my reaction have been if my mother had said from across the other side of the continent, "I'm going to kill myself," which is what she did say, and why Kathy then picked up the phone to me and said, "My mother's just told me she's going to kill herself, and would we make a film out of it?" And I said yes, and I'm asking you whether you'd be the exec producer. And I said yes. So that's how kind of unorganized the whole beginning was. Um, but in terms of the emotional relationships, I think a lot of people ask me whether or not being a grief counselor is depressing or saddening or upsetting. And the answer is no, it's not. I find that being able to do the work that I do with individuals and being able to see them come through the period from the acute grief that they're feeling as a result of the loss of a loved one, for example, to the sense of becoming accepting of the new reality is very satisfying, and it's the transition in grief counseling parlance. It's the transition from acute grief to integrated grief, and you try and lead people towards a situation in which the grief is still there, but it's integrated into the life of the surviving relative. You never get over it, nor should you. It's just trying to weave that new factor of Uncle Joe not being there anymore, or other loved one, into the fact that that's part of the new world, the new reality you're living in.
Wow. And now one of the things that you talked about before we joined the discussion was the family was involved in the editing and they had to relive this moment over and over and over again. Um, what,
Yeah.
how did they react to that experience?
um, they both reacted in a slightly different way. It's worth mentioning that when you're putting together a documentary and the initial target was for feature-length documentary, a little bit under 2 hours. That's going to take typically at least 6 to 9 months to put it all together, because you're literally going through the film frame by frame by frame and joining it together and looking for which bits follow on from which other bits and which bits are exciting and high points and full of energy and which bits are calm and tranquil. And that takes a lot of time. Now, picture, if you can, what happens if the documentary that you're helping the people to cut is the documentary about your mother's death, a death that you were present for, you and your daughter. And you have to look at this time and time and time and time again, just so that it cuts together better. Do you when they were pouring out the champagne, do you stay on the close up of the neck of the bottle, or do you take it in the wide shot? All of that kind of stuff. And of course, Kathy and Sam had to relive the moment of Laura's death. I would think at least 100 times.
Mm.
Now, from Kathy's point of view, she's a professor now at the Western Australia University, but from Kathy's point of view, she's an old seasoned documentary maker, and it didn't really break stride for her because she had made many, many, many documentaries in the past. For Sam's point of view, the younger granddaughter who had been with Laura on the trip down the Rhine, it felt that much closer to her. And she was a lot more upset by having to work through the scenes of grandma ending her own life. So it's kind of what you might imagine, but quite difficult for them. And as a grief counselor, of course, that's when another part of my job began, because I explained to them quite early on that there would be different stages in the grief that they would feel, one of which would be in the cutting room when they have to keep watching the death. And it was important to be able to get them to understand that, because it was tricky, but they managed very well.
All right. Okay, so let's and I just opened my email. I've got tons of requests for the film, so that's cool. And a bunch of people have been finding it on Prime Video. So one way or another, if you're interested, we'll get you there. But let's dive into the questions here that
Sure.
have been coming in. Ken asks, please discuss the grief of losing a loved one to dementia, even if the death is some time off. I guess as a grief counselor, this is probably something that you are dealing with quite a bit now.
A lot. I would think it probably takes up about 25% of all my cases, where the loved one has become the caregiver. And initially, that's, of course, what you do. You're going to take your wife tea in bed. You're going to make sure she's comfortable. You're going to make sure she's, hair's brushed and all that kind of stuff. But as we all know, as the disease progresses and begins to nibble away at more and more important parts of the brain, the facility and the agency in the patient declines very rapidly. And what one has to do in that situation is to treat the caregivers as grief clients as well as the patient, because what tends to happen, which is rather, I suppose, curious but inevitable, is that the patient is busy withdrawing from life and withdrawing from the caregivers, withdrawing from the medical staff and all the rest of it, disappearing into their own world, and likewise not really needing grief counseling so much as just a sympathetic hand, or someone to moisten their lips, or someone to feed them a little bit of soup. And they don't need a grief counselor for that. They need a qualified end of life nurse, not the caregiver, because the caregiver can soon experience burnout. So at a certain point in the trajectory of the death process, I am spending more time with the caregivers and the loved ones than I am with the patient. And what I have to do in that situation is to enable them to see how the process will unfold, and what to expect and what not to expect, and what to feel okay about, and how not to beat yourself up, because grieving caregivers often try to beat themselves up about, I could have done this, I should have done that, what if we'd done this, if only we'd done that. Those are, in grief counseling parlance, those are forbidden because they don't help. They're not going to change the outcome, and they don't help the individual who did the best they could at the time. So we have a bit of a game where I'm allowed to chip in and say, no, not allowed, whenever I hear coulda, woulda, shoulda, or if only and what if. But yes, the job for the grief counselor really picks up about 2 or 3 weeks before the death, as the patient is moving into active dying, and it's becoming quite clear that there's days or weeks to go, not months.
All right. Let's see. Patricia asks, if a person gets the green light on dying by choice, there can be a great sense of calm for them, even if they don't use it. And we talked about that earlier. Just knowing that you've got that choice. Do you find that?
Yes. I wouldn't say necessarily that there's calm, but there's certainly excitement, and a kind of, at last, I've managed to fulfill my objective here after all that bureaucracy. The slight problem with the question about the green light is that, of course, in Laura's case, when she got the green light from the Pegasus Clinic in Basel in Switzerland, she'd already coughed up a fair amount of money. So she was less inclined to say no, not anymore, because she'd already invested time and effort into it. But the Philip Nietzsche, who is one of the principal uh, uh, figures in the assisted dying community. He was talking to me at the time about the fact that if in certain countries you can be prescribed the lethal dose of typically pentobarbital, to have in your drawer, and for the people who have asked and got that lethal dose to keep to one side until the time at which they want to do it and end their own lives, they tend not to. They tend to get some calm from the fact that it's there if I need it, but I just don't need it today. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that. But nevertheless, that does happen. And Philip was telling me how, people can live for years after they've been, given the medication, if the medical recourse begins to work for them.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right. Sheila asks, have you seen the movie The Room Next Door? And if so, what did you think of the movie? A friend who's an advocate of voluntary death decisions warned me off the movie for some reason.
Oh, well, I'm afraid you have the better of me because I haven't seen the movie.
Okay. All right. Um, and I just looked it up, Sheila, and I see that it does have some uh, sort of mixed reviews, just at a quick glance. Okay. Ken asks, does dementia preclude medically assisted death, and can someone who is diagnosed with irreversible disease make a decision in advance. And I think we had talked about that is key in your advanced care planning. Is
Yes, that it's a gray area. It's worth mentioning that in many places where medically assisted dying is permitted, mental illness is not allowed to be a qualifying condition. Um, it is allowed in Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, and I think Spain, but I'm not sure. Um, but in other places, including here in the States, mental illness is not allowed to be a qualifier. I think that will change in time, but at the moment, it needs to be something, you know, more
and
akin to a cancer or a heart condition or whatever.
and Ken asks, how do you feel about support groups during the process of losing a loved one? And I see in the chat that uh, Patricia has shared that she runs a death cafe where you talk about all kinds of end of life issues and a lot of interest in that. But support groups in general for Ken, for somebody who either is going through or is grieving the loss of somebody.
Sure. I mean, there are lots of support groups. I'm a big fan of death cafes, by the way, because I think that we need to encourage people to talk more about death and dying, which has been a somewhat taboo subject here in the US. Unlike other parts of the world where death and dying is a part of community life, in the village, that's what happens. And granny goes and a new baby's born and the cycle continues. Um, but there are support groups for almost every aspect of death and dying. There are support groups for people who've lost a child, support groups for people who've lost a spouse, support groups for people who've lost a parent, and so on. I'm not aware of any particular support groups with regard to um, medically assisted dying, although, of course, there are lots of support groups that treat what are called the survivors of suicide, SOS. And I give talks and things to the international SOS community. But of course, that's after the event. That's post-mortem. It's not pre-mortem. I'm not aware of any groups like that, although it just might be worth asking the folks at Pegasus or Exit or Dignitas or uh, Life Circle whether they're aware of those kind of groups.
And Elva says, I just learned last year Dignitas charges about $10,000 for their services, plus airfare, hotel, and travel expenses. And you must bring a companion. Does Pegasus, is that a similar
Yes.
fee, or do you know? Okay.
It's in that kind of range. I mean, if you are a resident of a country that has this service, then you're likely to be able to, in some cases, approach your health, national health service if you have one. Um, but for most people, it's a private transaction, and yes, that figure of 10,000 is certainly the right figure for Pegasus. I don't know about the other ones, but it seems to be in that kind of order, up to maybe 5,000 in some places or 15 in others. But yeah, 10,000 is not a bad figure to have in mind. And yes, almost all of them want to have some kind of companion, whether a relative or a close friend, just to sort of be a support for everyone.
Okay. And then this is oh, where was it? Okay, Eugenia says it's my understanding that Vermont has eliminated the residency requirements for death with dignity, less expensive than going to Switzerland. However, it's different, correct? That if you had a cognitive impairment like dementia in Vermont, it might you might not be able to utilize those services.
I'm not sure of the answer to that. I don't
Okay,
want to
all right.
mislead anyone. Um, I would suspect that again, for residents of Vermont, there will be a set of rules that enable them to do it. For non-residents, it might not be available.
Okay, all right. Let's see. Okay, I'm just glancing here at some of these questions. I see that we burned through an hour already. Um, and I just want to make sure that we are addressing most of the questions that have been, let's see, Elvis says residency requirements are not in Vermont or Oregon. To my knowledge, those are the only two such states in the US. Um, and oh, there was a question earlier that related to life insurance, like or insurance and things of that nature. To your knowledge, like if somebody made this choice, would it be would it impact their how their life insurance was administered?
I don't know.
Okay.
And I hesitate before saying I don't know because it's a very, very interesting area of discussion. Because if you're cynical, you could say that it would be in the interests of the insurance company to encourage people to take medically assisted dying because it would be a lot cheaper than 10 or 15 years of end of life care. So I mean, there's a big ethical discussion to be had there, but I don't know of any insurance company that at the moment factors in medically assisted dying for their clients.
Okay. Um, all right, Chris, this has been uh okay. Dixie says life insurance, you die from your disease, not medical aid. Let's see. Victoria says all the laws passed in the US have a provision that the cause of death and underlying condition, not medical aid in dying. So life insurance isn't affected. This is impacted. That makes sense, and that's great to know. Chris, this has been amazing. I uh, the great discussion, learning about this profession of grief counseling, your real life story and my real life story of somebody choosing medical aid and dying, and all the great comments and ideas and questions that have been thrown in there. I, my email box is full. So Chris, I'm gonna send the link for the Vimeo that you sent to me. I will copy you on that just in case I got something wrong or somebody has a question. And
Sure thing.
um, I want to thank you so much and thank everybody for participating in a great discussion today. And you know, while what I've learned personally, that while I was always nervous about end of life discussions, I find that when that I look forward to them now, because when we talk about end of life, we're actually talking about and thinking about how we want to live our lives the remaining time.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And I also think that there's no way to have a shallow conversation on end of life. You know, this is not small talk, folks. This is deep thought and the meaning of life and how each of us define that. So
That's right.
so again, thank you. I'm thrilled to have
Sure
made.
thing. It's been my pleasure. And if any of your viewers want to get in touch with me, please go right ahead. It's very easy. Maybe Steve, you can put the email address and everything in your.
I'll put it in the recording link,
Yeah, that's it.
prominently in the recording link.
That'll be fantastic.
That'll be at proaging.com. So we'll get that up as soon as we can.
Okay.
And until the next one, again, thanks so much.
Good to see you. And thank you.